Hey friends, welcome back to the Animal Nerd podcast. I'm your host, an absolute mess, and I am so happy that you are here. Today, we're going to be talking about a cow who chose her own destiny, and in doing so, changed thousands of lives, both human and animal. This is the story of Emily the cow. It's the 14th of November 1995, and a trader of cows has just arrived at A Arena in Sons Inc., a slaughterhouse in the Massachusetts town of Hopkinton. Nothing unusual about that. At this point in time, about 500 animals were delivered there every week. Mostly cattle, but sometimes pigs and even goats. One of these cows is a 2-year-old Holstein heifer, who's destined for the butcher's counter because despite being a dairy breed, she's been unable to get pregnant. That means she's also unable to produce milk, and that means that, from a farming perspective, she's useless. The only money she could bring in is through turning her into meat, and so that's been decided as her fate. This cow is, of course, Emily, although at this point in time she was nameless, identified as an individual only by the number on the plastic identity tag in her ear. We don't know how much Emily knew about what awaited her on the other side of those abattoir doors, but certainly she would have been able to feel the fear of her fellow cattle. She would have heard them calling out in despair and smelt their blood. One by one, the cows in the pen were herded through the doors, never to come out again. And then it was Emily's turn. In a few minutes she would become one of the over 7 billion animals slaughtered in the US that year. And that's when Emily made a decision that would change not only her life, but the lives of countless humans and animals around the world. She was stuck between a rock and a hard place, or more accurately, a slaughterhouse and a gate which, at 5 foot tall, was impossible for a cow to jump over. Or at least, it should have been impossible. After all, cows aren't built for jumping like horses are. They're big, bulky animals, and there's a reason they're not known for their agility. But it seems that Emily knew that her life was in danger, that she had mere moments left. So she jumped. And she cleared it. She landed on all 4 feet on the other side, and she took off running. Cows don't do that. They don't just randomly decide to jump something that they shouldn't be physically capable of jumping. Except for Emily, apparently. The slaughterhouse staff watched in shock as this 1,400-pound animal leapt as nimbly as a cat. And once they had a second to actually process what they'd just seen, they immediately gave chase. After all, that was $500 of prime steak. They couldn't just let her get away. But Emily was too fast for them, and bolting into the nearby woodland, she hid herself amongst the trees, hiding away so that they had to give up their hunt. But the arena slaughterhouse weren't giving up on Emily without a fight. They continued searching for her regularly, bringing guns with them and leaving out hay near the abattoir to try and lure her back. The local police were informed and they also joined in on the chase, more than willing to dispatch her if she posed a potential risk to public safety. But for the most part, Emily kept to herself. She wasn't spotted that often, hiding well away from humans, and frankly I don't think you can blame her given what they'd put her through. But escaping the slaughterhouse didn't mean that Emily was safe. I mean, obviously there's the fact that she was being actively hunted down by the people she'd escaped from, and a couple of times they were able to find and corner her, although she always managed to give them the slip. But even aside from that, this was November in Massachusetts, and New England winters are no joke. And Emily wasn't a wild animal. She didn't know how to survive in the wild, to forage for her own food and keep herself safe and warm. And all on her own out there was no one to teach her. But Emily did manage to find some semblance of companionship out there in the forest. Perhaps even friends who could help her learn how to survive. Several times she was spotted travelling in the company of a herd of deer who seemed happy to accept her into their fold as just a particularly large lumbering doe. But even so, Emily struggled to find enough food to keep herself going, let alone enough to also keep her warm, and things only got worse after a blizzard left snow a foot deep on the ground, burying what little plant matter there was. It was clear that Emily wouldn't be able to last long if left out there alone, but she continued to evade capture despite the abattoir and the police's best efforts. Emily wasn't actually the first of her kind to escape the slaughterhouse. 2 bulls had escaped on separate occasions years prior, and neither of them had lasted long before being shot. Given everything she'd been through, Emily probably didn't expect much from humans. So far in her short life, they'd hardly given her any reason to trust them. And yet it was the kindness of humans that saved her life. You see, word had begun to spread around town about the daring cow who leapt to freedom and was now living in the woods as a bovine refugee, and something about her story just really resonated with people, and not just vegetarians. Even people who wouldn't otherwise think twice about tucking into a hamburger or steak were rooting for her, so much so that people began leaving hay and feed out for Emily to help her get through the winter, and would refuse to report any sightings they had of her to the authorities for fear of her being recaptured and returned to the slaughterhouse. This next fact I can't verify 100%, so take it with a grain of salt, but apparently some people would even go so far as to deliberately report false information to put Emily's would-be captors off the scent. Pretty soon, Emily had an entire underground network of animal lovers looking out for her and doing what they could, but ultimately there was only so much help she could be given while she was still running wild. There was only so long that Emily could survive for out there in the woods. Sooner or later, she'd either fall foul of the police or slaughterhouse, or she'd succumb to the harsh winter weather and lack of food. But there wasn't much more that anyone could do. Emily was estimated to be worth about $500 to the slaughterhouse, and that was hardly a paltry sum. And even if you could convince the arenas to sell her to you and could afford the fee, what then? Cows need a lot of space, and again, most people don't just have a field and barn going spare. Although Emily did for the most part keep herself secreted away in the woods, she would occasionally venture further afield, once even deciding to pay a visit to the centre of town and causing a traffic jam in the process. Because would it really be an episode of the Animal Nerd podcast where our protagonists didn't make themselves a public nuisance at least once? A while later, Emily went out on a different adventure, this time dropping in on a resident who was putting up Christmas decorations outside his house. She ran away as soon as she saw him, but this was actually one of the best places she could have gone, because it just so happened that this guy, Bob Ahern, was a vegetarian and all-round animal lover, and absolutely the kind of person who would have done all he could for a cow in need, if only she'd stuck around long enough. From what I can tell, Emily received her first proper press coverage on the 19th of December, over a month after her bid for freedom, when local newspaper The Middlesex News documented not only her escape, but also what she'd been up to in the time since, including her visit to Bob Ahern. He spoke to them about the encounter and ended with this quote, "If she stopped, I would have fed her. I'd even buy her if I had the space." And those two sentences would change the course of Emily's life forever. Because of the many local people who picked up that day's edition of the newspaper and discovered Emily's story for the first time, one of them was Meg Rander, a woman from the nearby town of Sherborne who already had something of a reputation as someone who took action for the things she believed in. Together with her husband Lewis, she ran the Life Experience School, which catered to disabled students, as well as the Peace Abbey, which is an interfaith retreat dedicated to working towards world peace and celebrating those who do. Honestly seems like an incredible place. Devout Quakers, Meg and Lewis Rander were absolutely people who lived by their principles, and perhaps their greatest conviction was that of non-violence. Their entire lives were dedicated to the fight for peace, and for them a natural step on that path was to stop eating meat. As far as they were concerned, violence against animals was as wrong as violence against their fellow humans, and making a stand against one but not the other would be simply hypocritical. After a couple of years of being vegetarians, they'd taken the plunge and become fully vegan about 6 months before Emily's escape. So, understandably, the story of a cow who chose to save herself from being slaughtered for meat resonated deeply with them. About a month before Emily escaped, and 2 months before she made the news, Meg had been driving a group of her students to a local farm, where they would be volunteering to help grow produce to donate to the local homeless shelter. And while on the way, they'd passed the arena slaughterhouse. Meg had no idea there was an abattoir so close by. Most people didn't. Understandably, most businesses of that sort prefer to keep their heads down specifically to avoid the attention of animal rights activists like Megan. And just knowing that there was somewhere so close to home that was the site of so much bloodshed really stuck with Meg. She was really troubled by it, but what could she do? And then, a couple of months later, she read about a cow escaping from that very slaughterhouse, and in particular she read that quote from Bob Ahern, "I'd even buy her if I had the space." Meg had the space. The shared grounds of the Life Experience School and the Peace Abbey were already home to 2 horses and a goat, alongside various smaller animals. There was nothing stopping them from welcoming a cow into their family, so why not? Pretty much straight away, Meg phoned the paper to ask if there were any updates, and then she went about trying to get in touch with Frank Arena, the owner of the slaughterhouse. He was away on business at the time, not uncommon as he purchased cattle at auction across Massachusetts and Connecticut, but as soon as he returned, Meg and Lewis approached him about purchasing Emily. Frank initially wanted $500 for Emily, seeing as that's what he'd get for her in the form of meat, but given that she'd lost a lot of weight during her time on the run, he was willing to reduce that price to $350. However, after consulting with his own family and finding out that the Randers wanted Emily for the students at their school to care for, he was moved enough that he was willing to waive the price almost entirely, deciding to sell her to them for a token price of $1. And so, on the 20th of December, Emily officially became the property of the Randers, and was finally free from the risk of ending up on a plate. However, convincing the Arenas to sell them Emily would turn out to be the easy part, because they still had to find a way to catch Emily and bring her back to the Peace Abbey, and that was going to be a much harder job. And because I just realised I never mentioned it, her name Emily was apparently given to her by Frank Arena's granddaughter sometime between her escaping and the first media coverage. But anyway, with the assurance that Emily was now theirs, Meg and Lewis, with the help of their children and friends, including Bob Ahern, set about trying to track Emily down, which was going to be no mean feat. They headed straight out to find her, but it took hours, and despite searching everywhere they could think of, and seeing plenty of evidence that Emily had indeed been in the area, they returned home empty-handed, without having caught so much as a glimpse of the Holstein. But they vowed that they would go back out there every single day until they were successful. And so they did. And on the next day, the 21st, their persistence was rewarded when they finally got to see Emily in person for the first time, as she emerged from the woods to pick up some of the hay they left there the day before. Once Emily realised she had an audience, she fled, as she usually did whenever she saw someone. But the Randers weren't going to give up now. They knew it would take time to gain the trust of an animal who'd been so badly treated by humans, but they were willing to do whatever they could to bring her home. Their hope was that they'd be able to bring Emily to the Peace Abbey in time for Christmas. But in that case, the clock was ticking. They followed Emily to a clearing amongst the trees, and spent hours out there in the snow, offering her grain from a bucket and trying to show her that they weren't a threat. And somehow, Emily seemed to understand that these people weren't like the other ones she'd encountered. She stopped trying to run from them, and before long, she felt comfortable getting close enough to them to sniff their hands and eat out of the offered bucket, even as they held it. And all the while, the local press couldn't get enough, and were giving daily updates on the latest Emily news. The Rounders returned the next day to continue building their bond with Emily, and on this occasion they were joined by a local journalist, who was immediately freaked out when they saw Emily for the first time and realised just how big she was. And this was despite the fact that she'd lost a lot of weight during her time in the wild. She was just such a big, bulky animal, no one could believe she would ever be capable of jumping as high as she did, and yet at the same time, there could never be any doubt about it. Several professionals, mostly cattle hands and vets, reached out to offer their own advice on catching errant cows. The arenas themselves even offered to help the Rounders catch Emily, but they didn't want to resort to chasing her down or doing anything that would further traumatise her when she'd already been through so much. Their goal was to gain her trust to the point where they'd be able to lure her onto a trailer, although they did also consider potentially sedating her as a last resort. There was one slight hurdle though, in that the Rounders didn't own a trailer suitable for animal transport. Luckily for them though, a friend stepped in and offered them the use of his. The trailer was backed into the clearing on the 23rd, and it was hoped that leaving it open and filled with hay would be enough to encourage Emily to get in of her own free will. But in true animal fashion, Emily refused to cooperate. And given that the last time she'd been in a trailer had been to bring her to a slaughterhouse, can you really blame her? Despite the fact that it was freezing cold with about a foot of snow on the ground, the Rounders decided to spend the night camping in a tent near the clearing, so they could keep watch on the trailer and shutter it straight away if Emily decided to get in. Emily did not decide to get in, and I think this was the point where the Rounders realised that the only way they were going to be able to get Emily loaded was to use a little more physical persuasion. Although Emily had refused to enter the trailer on the first day it was there, one of their friends had managed to get a rope around Emily's neck, and on the morning of Christmas Eve, after 4 long days of trying to catch Emily, the Rounders and their friends finally managed to catch her. They attached a long lead to the rope around her neck and threaded it through the trailer, and through a combination of pulling on the rope and pushing her from behind, they managed to get her up and into the trailer. Emily wasn't best pleased about it, as you can imagine, but it meant that at long last, after 40 days of struggling to survive on her own, she was finally safe, for the first time in her life. A stall had already been prepared for Emily back at the Peace Abbey, with deep warm bedding and plenty of hay. And as it was Christmas Eve, it had been decorated accordingly, including a stocking stuffed with hay and oats, and welcome signs made by her supporters adorning the walls. What more could a cow ask for? When she was first brought home, Emily was shaking with fear, but before long she seemed to realise that this was a safe place, and that no one was going to hurt her here. But her time in the wild had clearly taken its toll on her. She was so skinny you could see her ribs, having lost about 500 pounds since she leapt the gate, and her rump was still adorned with the meat inspection sticker as a lingering reminder of how close she came to death. Meg, Lewis and their 3 children immediately welcomed Emily as a member of the family, even opting to have their Christmas dinner of vegetable stew and tofu out in the barn with her, their table set up just outside her stable door so she could put her head over and be part of things. In fact, she was such a part of things that she stole the bread they were eating right out of their hands. During her stint of freedom, Emily had received regular media coverage from the Middlesex News, but now that the story of her escape had concluded and had a picture book happy ending, it was picked up by more outlets, including ones with a bigger reach. And while there were some people who were critical of what the Rounders had done, with one guy going so far as to claim that vegetarianism was anti-Christian, because apparently there's nothing God hates more than people having compassion for other living beings, most people were supportive. I mean, it was such a wholesome story, right down to the fact that Emily finally came home on Christmas Eve. And given the amount of coverage Emily's story received, and how many people loved it, it's no surprise that pretty quickly people were flocking to the Peace Abbey to pay a visit for the cow they'd heard so much about, with some people even pledging to her that they were going to give up eating meat entirely because they were so moved by her story. And speaking of her story, there was also pretty much immediately interest from film producers who saw the obvious potential in what was literally just a real-life version of a feel-good Christmas movie. Meg herself had plans to write a children's book about Emily, but I'm unsure as to whether or not it ever actually came out. I certainly couldn't find anything saying that it had. Despite initially being anxious when she arrived at her new home, Emily soon came out of her shell, and once she realised that people no longer wanted to hurt her, she soon overcame her fear of them and actually ended up preferring the company of humans over animals. And luckily for her, there was never any shortage of people wanting to shower her with love and affection. Emily had a profound impact on everyone who came to visit her. As I said earlier, a large number of people were so moved by meeting her and learning her story that they decided to stop eating meat. One woman even went as far as to set up her own animal sanctuary so that she could help rescue more animals like Emily, who would have run if they'd had the chance. But for some people, it went even deeper than that. Perhaps the most incredible example of Emily's impact was on a woman who was stuck in an abusive relationship, one that she desperately wanted to leave but had never quite been able to. But meeting Emily and learning about her escape helped this woman find the courage and strength within herself to finally end the relationship. And perhaps one of the cutest Emily stories comes from less than a week after she was rescued. A young couple were getting married, and their wedding ceremony was being held at the Peace Abbey. This was only 5 days after Emily arrived there, so I'm assuming that it was all arranged before they knew she'd be a part of it. But the happy couple absolutely wanted the famous cow to be a part of their big day, with Emily's involvement often being described as a kind of honorary bridesmaid. She was, of course, featured in their wedding photos, and tried at least once to eat the bride's bouquet. Emily's story continued to garner media attention, including 2 features in People magazine. For the second article, photographers were sent from New York to get some shots of Emily, and she really seemed to like them. They gave her some famous New York bagels, since bagels were one of her favourite treats, and then she decided to play with them. Unfortunately, not being too experienced with cows, the photographers freaked out when Emily started running at them, with one of them hiding behind a tree and another climbing atop a stone wall to escape. Poor Emily, all she wanted was to play! Emily also featured on both national and international TV programmes, as well as plenty of coverage in print media locally, nationally, and around the world. And as Emily's fame spread, she received emails, letters, and cards from fans all around the world, as well as, of course, plenty of in-person visitors, with hundreds of people coming to see her in the first year alone. Unfortunately, the planned Emily movie never materialised. They did find producers to work with, and several times they would put out a rough date of when it was hoped the film would start production or hit cinemas, but that date kept getting pushed further and further back, first by months and then by years, and ultimately the project would never come to fruition, which is a shame, but at least Emily got something out of it. Of all the offers that were made, it was First Look Studios that the Randers chose to partner with as their production/distribution company, as its founders Robert and Ellen Little were both vegan and had rescued animals themselves in the past, so of course their visions aligned much more with the Randers than the bigger production companies might have. And while the film may have never come out, early on the Littles did fund the building of a brand new barn for Emily at the Peace Abbey, which cost $10,000 and which also served as the Greater Boston Vegetarian Resource Centre, which was basically a library full of meat-free cookbooks and literature on animal rights and animal welfare, as well as a TV and video player with videos on similar topics. The Peace Abbey regularly hosted people from different religions visiting from around the world, who were united by their shared belief in non-violence and pacifism. And once Emily moved in, she was also something of a draw, especially for Hindus to whom the cow is sacred. Hindu priests and disciples visited her while travelling from India and prayed to her. They presented her with a handmade sacred blanket and adorned her forehead with a bindi. They believed that she was the reincarnation of a sacred cow, and blessed her accordingly. And they weren't the only people who came from afar to pay their respects. Emily also hosted 8 Buddhist nuns who were visiting the US from Tibet. Back at their nunnery, they had saved a lot of animals from slaughterhouses, especially sheep, so it was no surprise that they'd want to meet her. There were also any number of high-profile individuals and activists who met Emily on their trips to Peace Abbey, probably more than I could fit into this episode, but Emily never had her head turned by fame. She didn't care if you were rich and famous or a normal human being. She didn't care what religion you followed, if any. She loved everyone equally and just adored people, especially children. And of course she was beloved by the students of the Life Experience School, who were involved in helping to care for her. When one student slipped on ice and fell down a hill while working outside the barn, Emily called and called when it became clear he couldn't get up, until someone heard her and came to the student's rescue. It would later turn out that he'd broken his pelvis, and could have been lying out there much longer if Emily hadn't sounded the alarm. He later went as far as to credit her with saving his life. Of course, although Emily was the most high-profile animal at the Peace Abbey, she wasn't the first. There had already been a few when she arrived, and more would follow. One of these was a calf named Gabriel, who would otherwise have been destined for veal. Although Emily had never had a calf of her own, she seemed to almost adopt Gabriel, tenderly grooming him and licking him as though he was her own baby. Another rescued resident was Belle, a 5-year-old goat, and her kids Jacob and Joshua, who'd jumped off a truck destined for a slaughterhouse. There was at least one other veal calf, although I couldn't find its name anywhere, and an adult Holstein cow, the same breed as Emily, who was named Gloria, and who had also escaped from a truck. Plus there was a pig named Belle, and 2 turkeys named Thanks and Giving, and I'm sure there have been more since. The Peace Abbey may not have been an official animal sanctuary, but they've certainly taken in a lot of animals who would otherwise have found themselves on someone's plate. While I don't doubt that the other animal residents at the Peace Abbey were loved by locals, it seems none of them were ever quite so widely adored as Emily. And while media coverage of her slowed down after a while, she was still a beloved local figure for the 8 blissful years she had at the Peace Abbey. She was still being visited, still having donations made to her care costs, still the centre of ceremonies and events, and she truly thrived. That is, until the beginning of March 2003, when Emily was 10 years old, when she became lethargic and started losing weight, and despite usually being outgoing and affectionate towards people, she instead became much more withdrawn. The Randers were obviously deeply concerned, and immediately called the vet, who would go on to diagnose her as having cancer of the uterus. And suddenly Emily was once again making local news for all the wrong reasons. There was talk as to what would happen. The only thing that could potentially have been done to treat her cancer would be chemotherapy, something which had never before been done on a cow. And the Randers did consider it, but ultimately felt that it wouldn't be in Emily's best interests, as chemotherapy has some pretty horrific side effects, and there was no evidence that it would work. Instead, they put all of their time and energy into managing her symptoms to allow her to live pain-free for as long as possible, and also held a healing ceremony led by a local Hindu priest. On Sunday the 30th of March 2003, less than a month after she first started showing symptoms, Emily passed away peacefully in her sleep. Emily's death was met with an outpouring of grief, both locally and nationally, and her passing was reported across the country. She was a symbol of hope and a figurehead of animal rights. For 2 days, Emily lay in state. In her stall, she was draped with her sacred blanket, with flowers around her neck, another Hindu symbol of respect. Hundreds of people came to pay their respects and say goodbye to the animal who represented so much to them. Hairs were taken from the tuft on the top of Emily's head and the tip of her tail, and these, together with some of her blood, were taken to India and released into the Ganges, in line with Hindu custom. Almost immediately, there were plans to immortalise Emily in the form of a life-size statue at the Peace Abbey. They already had statues built of several high-profile pacifists and activists, and they wanted Emily to be a part of that. Not only that, but they wanted to build a whole memorial to her, similar to the pacifist memorial they already had, which included over 60 bronze plaques, which bore prayers for peace from the world's 12 major religions, as well as quotes from people who dedicated their lives to making the world a better place, like Martin Luther King Jr. and Mahatma Gandhi. The Sacred Cow Animal Rights Memorial, as it would come to be known, was planned to be more or less the same, only with quotes about animal welfare. Emily was buried beneath the spot where her statue was to be put, and a memorial service was held for her at the Abbey. It had been intended to coincide with the unveiling of her statue, but delays in its manufacture meant that that couldn't happen. Instead, it had its own unveiling ceremony when it finally arrived in April 2005. Made from solid bronze, the statue is life-size and depicts Emily clad in her sacred blanket and flowers. It even has the detail of the hole in her ear where her ID tag had once been, before it was removed after her rescue. And at the unveiling, the statue was blessed with flowers and water from the Ganges. Emily may have been gone, but her statue and the memorial in her honour continue to stand at the Peace Abbey as a testament to who she was and all she achieved. Who knows how much more she could have done if her life hadn't been so cut short by cancer. And yet, had it not been for her cancer, she may never have ended up at the Abbey at all. Emily had had cancer for a long time before anyone knew about it. Like most animals, she hid any symptoms she may have had, and so no one knows exactly when she first began to develop it, especially as some cancers can be very slow growing. But it's believed that the reason she was sent to the slaughterhouse so young was because she was unable to get pregnant, making her useless as a dairy cow. But if that's the case, then there had to be some kind of reason for that. And as the cancer was in her uterus, it's very likely that her infertility was caused by the beginnings of the disease. And all this time it had been slowly growing inside of her until it was too late to do anything. Emily was 10 years old when she passed away, which is young for a cow. They can live up to 20 years if they're allowed to, but most farm cows will never get that chance. Despite the fact that Emily was still relatively young when she passed away, she still lived longer than she would have done if she'd been a dairy cow, as once they reach the age of 6 or so, they're unable to produce as much milk and are slaughtered. Emily lived a life of freedom and love that most cows can only dream of, and the only reason she was able to live it was because she was able to jump something that should have been impossible for her. Many of her supporters believe that Emily's escape was an act of divine intervention, and while I'm not religious myself, I can see why people would believe that. It's believed that over the course of her life, Emily and her story caused hundreds, possibly even thousands of people to go vegan or vegetarian, or even just reduce their meat consumption without giving it up completely. She inspired people to get involved with the world of animal rescue and help save other animals like her. And as legacies go, I think hers is a pretty incredible one. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of the Animal Nerd podcast. I'm sorry I wasn't able to get one out last week, but my health just really got in the way and I wasn't able to. Honestly, I'm surprised it's taken this long for something like that to happen. But I'm back, and hopefully I'll be back next week as well. If you enjoyed this episode, it would mean the world to me if you could subscribe to the show wherever you're listening to it, and leave a positive review or comment. Those things all really help. So just sharing it with your friends. I'll have a link to the Peace Abbey in the show notes if you'd like to find out more about it, as well as links to all of my sources, including the book The Story of Emily the Cow, Bovine Bodhisattva, which was my main source for this episode. It compiles every single magazine and newspaper article written about Emily, at least I think it's all of them, and goes into way more detail than I could ever include in a podcast episode. So I'd really recommend checking it out if you want to know more about Emily and hear more cute anecdotes from those who knew her. As ever, social medias and contact info will all be in the show notes, and I think that's all I have to say for today. So until next time, thank you again for listening, and I will see you in the next one. Stay wild, friends!